Sometimes it doesn't always work, but hopefully it's actually going to record. Let me bring up the midterm study guide. All right, you can all see my screen, right?
Yes.
So the question number 6 was, so we covered questions number 1 through 5, ending with the inner light question. Question number 6 was briefly explain what the Republic of Letters was and how it brought or helped to bring the ideas of the European Enlightenment to the English colonies in North America. Give at least one example of an American intellectual who participated in this quote unquote republic. Okay. So, so what was the Republic of Letters? Can anybody give me a brief definition, 1 or 2 sentences? What was it in essence?
It was a intellectual organization where people wrote like lengthy letters to each other discussing science, politics, philosophy, and stuff like that.
The only word that I would take issue with there, Cole, is organization. It wasn't really an organization. It wasn't like you could join it. There was no membership fees or anything like that. It was more of a community, an intellectual community composed of literate, well-educated, usually socioeconomically elite men. There's a few women who participate in it, but it's mostly men on either side of the Atlantic who, as you just said, shared information about science, technology, philosophy, shared information from their researchers in various fields with one another, primarily by means of personal correspondence, i.e. letters. But when I say letters, I don't mean like, 1 or 2 paragraph emails like we're accustomed to sending to one another today. I mean lengthy, voluminous correspondence. We're talking 20, 30, 50 pages in length. These were really extended essays that they wrote to one another, and very often they're intended for publication. They often won't say it's intended for publication, but it was kind of a wink and a nod thing. I'm writing this to you. Do what you want with it. If you want to publish it, as a pamphlet with some press that you have connections with, go ahead. And a good example of this, because the question calls for an example. So the best example of this that I can think of would be, and there's many examples. There's a lot of American intellectuals, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, many others who have pen pals over in Europe, wealthy, well-educated friends who they exchange ideas with. But probably the best example of this would be Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which is the one full-length book that he ever writes. And it begins as a series of letters that he writes to a friend of his back in France it's all about his home colony. Hey, Brooke, how you doing? All about his home, not his his home state of Virginia. It's about it talks about the plant and animal life, the geography, social and political customs, and so on. He talks about slavery. He makes a number of what today would be regarded as extremely controversial, if not downright obscene, remarks about African Americans. He repeats a well-known or widely accepted falsehood at that time that African Americans that Black people in Africa regularly interbred with apes or monkeys. But that's an example of the Republic of Letters at work. All right.
I'm so sorry. I just joined and I couldn't get my audio to work. We were just talking about the Republic of Letters. Who was the person you were speaking about?
Thomas Jefferson and his
Okay.
book Notes on Virginia. It's the one full-length book that he ever writes. Jefferson, if you go to like NAU's library, Klein Library, you can probably find somewhere there a complete set of Jefferson's writings. They'd be in most research libraries. I don't know where exactly they'd have it, but just go there and look. It's several volumes long. He's a prolific letter writer, but he only writes one full-length book. And that would be Notes on Virginia. So, all right. So number 7 was, what was the Great Awakening? Discuss 2 of its major causes. So what was the Great Awakening in essence?
The Great Awakening was like a Protestant religious revival, focused on renewing like church membership and having academic and theological debates regarding the Protestant faiths.
Yeah. In essence, yeah, you're basically right there. We're talking about the first Great Awakening here, because there's going to be a second one. There's a second one that's going to happen early to mid 19th century that will be similar to it, but also different in some pretty significant ways. So yeah, it's the first great religious revival, overwhelmingly Protestant Christian denominations participating in it in American history, which starts around the 1730s or so and continues through about the 1750s, if you want a rough time frame. It's very ecumenical. Basically, all of the major religious denominations then present, all the major Christian denominations then present in North America participated, with the exception of the Catholics. They're kind of sidelined from that. As far as its major causes, I gave you 3 major causes that I think play a significant role. Different historians would probably break down its causes in different ways, but I think you got to identify at least 3 broad contributing factors. The first would be anxiety, because most of these colonists settling in English North America, they're coming from Europe overwhelmingly. They're coming from a part of the world where your religion is typically dictated to you by the state. You're told what church to belong to and how to practice your faith. And all of a sudden they show up in North America where there's a plethora of religious options, all Christian, of course. There's a handful of Jews practicing their faith in English North America, but not that many, mainly confined to a few corners of New York and Pennsylvania. So overwhelmingly it's Christian, but there's a plethora of different varieties of Christian traditions to choose from. You've got your Anglicans, obviously, your Congregationalists, i.e. the Puritan faith. You've got your Quakers, your Baptists, your Methodists, your Presbyterians. Down in Maryland, you've even got a healthy Catholic presence and so on. So you've got from the perspective of people coming from Europe, you've got a smorgasbord of religious options, which sounds great, right? We all like choice, especially we 21st century Americans. We love choice. We like to have options, multiple options for everything, so that's good for us, but from their context, having choice, while they might have liked to be able to choose where to go to church or whether to go to church, it also produced some anxiety because what if you chose wrong? And the one thing that all of these, or almost all these religious traditions that are present would have had in common is they all preached hell. They all believed in the reality of it, and heaven for that matter. And a lot of them would say, if you don't belong to our faith, you're not going to heaven. you're going to go to the other place. So all of a sudden, this choice is freighted with extreme emotional and spiritual significance. And that creates some anxiety. Cause number two, I defined as emotion. The two main religious traditions in North America, in English North America at the time, are Anglicanism and Puritanism. Both of those traditions, the predominant style of preaching in the churches was very dry and academic. They pick a text, like Deuteronomy 23, and they proceed to exegete it, meaning to interpret it in excruciating detail for like 2 or 3 hours. And that's really boring. Put people to sleep in the pews very often. Church was often the most uncomfortable nap people took all week long. And so the Great Awakening revivals, if nothing else, they're exciting. You've got verbal pyrotechnics being performed by people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and so on. People have to travel there. It's kind of like a vacation. They got to travel to the meeting place wherever the revival service is being held. They camp out, in these areas with other like-minded Christians. So there's an opportunity to have an emotional experience that they feel brings them closer to God. And the third major factor I identified was guilt. North American colonies growing increasingly prosperous, standards of living are improving, people are becoming more comfortable, and all of that is great, right? Who doesn't like to be comfortable? Who doesn't like to have a higher standard of living, to have more comfortable furniture and clothes, better house, and so on? All that's great, but it did lead to a sense on the part of many North American Christians that their society was becoming a lot more materialistic. And that led to a sense of guilt about their lives, about the choices that they were making and the way that they were living. Because one thing the Bible does say is the love of money is the root of all evil, right? So if your society is becoming increasingly materialistic, then that makes you question whether or not you're really living according to your Christian principles. All right, so those are your three major causes. And again, you don't have to give me all three. You could just give me two and give me basically a sentence or two description of what the Great Awakening was, and then like one sentence describing two of its major causes. And that'll be fine. Number 8, briefly describe three of the major tenets of the political ideology known as republicanism. Republicanism. All right, we went over this a few weeks ago. What was republicanism in a nutshell? First, tell me that. It's a political what?
Ideology.
Yes, that's exactly the word I was looking for. It's political ideology. What is an ideology? It's a system of what? It's a system of
Beliefs?
bingo. System of beliefs that governs political behavior. So, for example, your ideology is whatever system of beliefs that causes you to behave the way you do in a political context. So like if you're a Democrat, for example, because you believe in greater equality and helping out the needy and you're pro-choice or whatever, that's your system of beliefs that impacts your political behavior. All right. So in the case of republicanism, it's the system of beliefs that ultimately led many people in English North America to embrace the revolutionary cause, to embrace the American Revolution, and its underlying objective of separating the 13 colonies from the British Empire and becoming independent. Right? It's the system, it's the political ideology that leads to the American Revolution. And by the way, different historians will break it down different ways. I've tried to come up with a fairly simple scheme for describing this ideology, but other historians will provide you with different nuances, if you will. But as I put it in class, there are 4 major component parts to this ideology. The first is a balance between what and what.
Liberty and power.
Balance between liberty and power. Very good, Mikhail. Balance between liberty and power. They believed that the goal of politics, the goal of the political process in a Republican society should always be to maintain a proper balance between the power of the government and the liberty of the citizens. And that balance can get out of whack over time, right? Why? Because society changes. And the framers of the Constitution, they recognize that society changes. And as society changes, that balance needs to be adjusted over time, either in favor of more liberty for the citizens in some areas, or more power for the government in some areas. So the goal of the political process in a Republican society is to maintain a balance between the power of the government and the liberty of the citizens. So that's the first one. Second would be popular
Sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is essentially the right of the people to rule, the right of the people to make decisions for themselves, usually through participating in elections, for political leaders who will then make decisions on their behalf. Because obviously in a Republican society, you have elected representatives. That's the difference between a representative democracy, i.e. a republic, those two terms are more or less synonymous, versus a direct democracy, where all of the citizens make decisions, like in ancient Athens with the Athenian assembly. So, it's the right of the people to rule, or the right of the people to make decisions, including determining their basic political institutions, what institutions they will use to govern themselves, which has significant applications to the American Revolution, because obviously it's a belief in popular sovereignty that basically undergirds the whole revolutionary movement. We are a separate and distinct people from Great Britain, and we have the right to determine our own political destiny, right? Constitutional monarchy might work over there, but it's not working for us. And so we're going to try and do something different. Right? So popular sovereignty. Number 3 is an independent citizenry. Most of the people who embraced the revolutionary cause, especially the leadership, believed that the best possible citizens in a Republican society would be independent citizens. Independent how?
Financially?
Yes, financially independent. And in an 18th century context, that usually meant, not always, but usually meant owning land. Land was considered to be the most secure form of financial or economic independence. Which, by the way, is why they were so concerned, why most of our early political leaders were very concerned that the United States eventually expand its boundaries. It's why Jefferson and Madison, for example, are both big proponents of westward expansion, why Jefferson embraces the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, because they believed that in order for the United States to continue to develop as a Republican society, more of its citizens needed to be able to achieve the dream of land ownership. Last major component, civic virtue. They believed that in a Republican society, the citizenry, the citizen body needed to be virtuous. But when they talked about civic virtue, they're not just talking about virtues like Christian virtues that we would identify today, like being honest or being chaste or whatever. They're specifically talking about things that a virtuous citizen does. Okay. And what they fundamentally what they mean by civic virtue is a willingness, at least some of the time, to put your country first, to put your society or your community first, to do what is best for the whole rather than just yourself. And they believe that this is essential because they recognize that they're creating a system of government that is a lot less compulsory than most of the systems of government over in Europe. In other words, a system of government that has a lot less direct power over the people than most of the systems of government over in Europe. So in order for that system to work, the citizens, because the government has less power, the citizens need to be willing to step up. They need to be willing to step up and do what needs to be done for their community. How do citizens today express civic virtue?
By voting?
Okay, voting, yes. By participating in the political process, that's part of being a good citizen, right? Making sure that you, on election day, if need be, you schedule time in your day to show up at the polls, not just show up at the polls, but also cast an informed vote, right? Do a little bit of research, read about the candidates, actually know what you're voting for. Okay, how else?
Paying your taxes, I guess.
Maybe, obviously taxes are something that's compulsory, right? You don't really have a choice about whether or not you pay your taxes. But, like being honest on your tax returns, I guess you could say that that's an example of civic virtue. What else?
Could it be something as simple as just cleaning up your local park?
There you go. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, I'm the advisor, currently the lead faculty advisor to PTK, Phi Theta Kappa, and we have a service component to what we do. So we're supposed to do a certain number of service projects a year. So one of the things we do is we have we participate in Flagstaff's Adopt an Avenue program. We go clean up South Paseo del Flag, which is an avenue about 5 minutes away from campus. So volunteerism, absolutely. Also military service, right? That's an example of civic virtue. All the above. But what I want you to do for this essay question number 8 is basically explain what republicanism is, and then give me 3 out of the 4 major tenets, because I recognize that you're not necessarily going to remember all 3, or all 4, but hopefully you can remember at least 3 out of the 4. Number 9, describe at least 3 of the major problems faced by the British during the American Revolution that ultimately undermined their efforts to win that conflict. So I identified, I think it was 4 major problems that the British faced, 4 major long-term problems that undermined their war effort. What you got to do is basically give me 3 of them. So what was the first one? Start with an L.
Logistics.
Logistics. When we talk about logistics, what was their main logistical hurdle?
Supplies, not being able to get them.
Supplies and reinforcements, but okay, yeah, obviously any government has to get supplies and reinforcements to its army operating in the field. But for the British, they face an additional hurdle because Great Britain, in relation to the colonies, is
Across the ocean.
yeah, right. It's 3,000 to 4,000 miles away, depending on where you're going. and it's going to be a months-long journey for any ship going from Great Britain to North America. Obviously, that creates a pretty significant logistical hurdle, which they're mostly able to overcome because Great Britain does have the most powerful navy in the world. Right? They got over 200 warships of various classifications. They've also got the largest merchant marine fleet in the world. But the fact that the distance is so far means that over the long term, and remember the Revolutionary War, up until the Vietnam War, the Revolutionary War was actually our longest war ever. A lot of people don't realize that. It is our longest war ever. It lasts for 7 years. Over 7 years. No worries, Kevin. I don't care. I'm not really taking attendance for this review session, anyways. So yeah, so the fact that it's such a long distance means that over the long term, for the British, the war effort is going to be very what?
Expensive.
Expensive. They go deep into debt. And remember, they were already pretty deeply in debt because of the French Revolution. Not the French, sorry, what am I saying? The French and
The
Indian
7 Years War.
War. 7 Years War. The French and Indian War is what I meant to say, or AKA the 7 Years War, yeah. So, okay. So that's problem number one. What was number two? Problems of
Occupation.
Occupation. And there, the big, and you could almost kind of tie this into logistics, because it is also a logistical issue. But the biggest problem that the British faced once they got to North America, once their army got to North America, is that the 13 colonies were very what?
Spread out.
Yes, they're very spread out. They're very big. The surface area of the 13 colonies is more than twice the surface area of Great Britain. Just the 13 colonies, right? So it's a big country. And they've only got about 50,000 troops, right? They've got more troops than the Americans do. But in order to win the revolution, they basically have to occupy and hold all 13 colonies, and they just don't have the manpower to do it. And part of the reason why they don't have the manpower to do it is problem number three, hostile population. As the revolution goes on, more and more American. When the revolution starts, probably the loyalist and the patriot populations were roughly equivalent in strength or numbers. One founding father, John Adams, estimated that at the beginning of the revolution, about 1/3 of the colonists were in favor of the revolution, about 1/3 were against, i.e. Tories or loyalists, and about 1/3 didn't care either way. We don't have polls to verify that estimate, but it's probably pretty accurate. But over time, the revolutionary cause becomes a lot more popular. It's a lot more popular. Why? Because the British did a lot of things that pissed the colonists off. Big example would be the Prohibitory Act. Right at the beginning of the revolution, the British Parliament passes the Prohibitory Act, which basically attempts to cut off all commerce between the 13 colonies and the outside world. Well, that's going to hurt not just the patriots, but also the loyalists. And it ends up pushing a lot of loyalists or Tories into the patriot camp. And also a lot of the undecideds as well. The other big thing that helps to lead to a hostile population is the fact that the patriots make very good, the patriot side makes very good use of the militia troops. I mentioned this before. Remember the militia troops? I said, so all of the 13 colonies have, or all of the 13 states have a militia force of some size or description. Usually they're very poorly armed, very poorly led, very poorly trained. Anytime they go head to head with the British regulars, they go running. So they're not very much used in actual combat, but what they are useful for is harassing and intimidating and silencing Tories. So as time goes on, it becomes a lot more expensive and a lot more risky to be a Tory. So for most Tories, their response is going to be one of two things. Either they're going to shut up. Well, I guess maybe one of three things. Either they're going to shut up, or they're going to switch sides, at least superficially, in order to protect themselves, or they're going to leave. And a lot of them chose option number 3. Throughout the American Revolution, it is estimated that about 80,000 Tories left the colonies, and they went either to Canada or to the British Caribbean, or they went back to Great Britain. And because they're the people who left, you can probably intuit from that the fact that most of the people who were leaving were what type of people? Well, typically when you have a large out-migration from a particular region or country because of some unfortunate circumstance, a war or a plague, think about the Jews fleeing Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe because of the Nazis in the 1930s. Who were the people who left? They were the people who had
Money?
Yeah. They're usually the socioeconomic elite because they're the people who can afford to relocate.
So did it
Right.
cause like a brain drain almost in America?
I don't know if I'd say a brain drain, but it definitely caused a leadership vacuum on
Okay.
the Tory side, right? Because most of the Tories who are leaving are the more articulate, prominent, politically connected, wealthy people, the people who could have helped sustain the Tory side, the Tory cause in North America. They're the ones who get out while the getting is good. Incidentally, that also has long-term ramifications for American society after the revolution is over. Because when you have all these wealthy, prominent people leaving, that opens up leadership positions. When that opens up opportunities for social mobility and social advancement for the people who remain. So you see a lot of people from more middling or humble backgrounds moving up into positions of leadership, becoming justices of the peace in their local county, or county sheriff, or the president of banks, or whatever it might be. So it leads to more social mobility. It helps to make American society more democratic in the wake of the revolution. So, okay. Covered number 9. Number 10. This one's easy, real easy. At the Constitutional Convention, 1787, what was the Virginia plan? What was the New Jersey plan? How did the delegates at the convention resolve the differences between the two? So, Virginia plan, what was it? So both of these concern congressional representation, right? So the Virginia plan was to make representation in Congress for all of the states based on what?
Population?
Population. Now, just FYI, the Virginia plan would have also created a bicameral legislature. That's a nuance that a lot of people don't always realize. So they would have had an upper and a lower chamber, but in both houses, representation would have been based on population. So the more populous states would have had more votes. New Jersey plan was to basically keep the old system in place from the Articles of Confederation, where each state had equivalent representation. Under the Articles, each state had 1 vote. They could send as many representatives to Congress as they wanted, but those representatives had to decide for themselves how to cast their state's vote. So New Jersey plan would have kept that principle in place where each state has equivalent representation. Each state has equivalent weight in Congress. What do? They ended up compromising. And what they ended up producing was our current bicameral national legislature with a House of Representatives and a US Senate. House of Representatives, representation is based on population. That's why some, I don't want to misspeak here. I think Delaware is one of the ones that has one, right? Yeah. Yeah, and it's always had one, except for 10 years between 1813 and 1820. So Joe Biden's home state, one representative. California, 53, becoming 52 because they lost one at the last census because everybody wants to get out of California because nobody can afford to live there. But in the Senate, Delaware has exactly the same number of votes as California, which seems crazy on the surface of it, but that's how it works. And that was to maintain some type of balance between the power of the big states versus the small states. It was a concession that the small states extracted from the larger states in order to sign off on this thing. Any questions?
So you said they compromised to form the House of Representatives and what again?
House of Representatives and the US Senate, our current
Okay.
bicameral Congress. I have now covered all of the 10 short essay questions. Are there any of these key terms that you would like me to cover?
I have one. The Las Casa. It's like the second one, or the first one in the second column.
Yeah. So I used to do a discussion session on him. I might go back to it. Bartolomeu de las Casas, Devastation of the Indies. It's a famous account of Spanish colonization in the Caribbean. I switched over to Montesino versus Ferdinand just because I've been doing Las Casas for so long. Las Casas was a Dominican friar who briefly participated in Spanish colonization efforts in the Caribbean, but then became disenchanted with the many and varied abuses and atrocities being committed by the Spanish against the natives. And he ended up writing a devastating account of their activities. And some people think somewhat embellished account of their activities in the Caribbean called Devastation of the Indies. Another thing that he is famous for, although today he's remembered fairly as a champion of native rights. Unfortunately, there's also a black mark on his legacy in that he was also briefly an advocate for African slavery. Weirdly enough, because he thought that people of African ancestry were more physically robust and more capable of withstanding the physical exertions involved in being a slave in the Spanish colonies, more capable of being worked hard and for long hours and so on. And there was actually a degree of truth to that. When the Spanish start importing slaves from Africa, they do tend to live longer than the natives did, but that's probably because they had immunity to more of the diseases that the Europeans are bringing over, not because they're naturally better suited to hard labor than the natives were. So that's Las Casas.
Okay, thank you. I gotta go now, but
All right,
thank you for
well,
doing
I
all the
think we're
questions.
basically done. Any other questions about any of these? No.
I had a question.
Okay.
It's Mexica and then like an arrow and like tribute system. Did you
Okay,
kind
yeah.
of want us to just describe it or?
Yeah, know what it is. There'll be some degree of some type of question on that. So the Mexica are also known as the Aztecs, right? Both of those terms are used depending on what source you're looking at. Well, today the term Mexica is more in favor, especially among academics. But Aztec is still used in different contexts. And the tribute system was basically their political and economic system that they had vis-a-vis the outlying tribes that they had conquered in central Mexico, who were required to give them tribute in the form of supplies, food, goods, but also especially annual labor drafts to build their many and impressive public works projects, and also human sacrifices. And the last part of it functioned, served both a religious purpose, because usually the human sacrifices are being sacrificed to appease their very gods, but also a lot of scholars think served as a form of like state-sponsored terror, kind of like the Hunger Games, right? If you go to, how many of you read the Hunger Games? Okay. So the basic purpose, and the author explains it pretty well. The basic purpose behind the Hunger Games is to intimidate the outlying districts into submission, right? By reminding them on a regular basis that anytime we want to, we can basically exterminate all y'all, which works for a while until somebody else bigger and badder and scarier shows up on the scene. And then the system doesn't work anymore. And that's basically what happened when the Spanish show up. Any questions? Nope. All right. Adios, guys. Bye-bye.